intend for it to do today. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, I have never been to Paris, so I have never had the opportunity of visiting the Louvre, the National Art Museum there. The Louvre is home to some of the most well-known pieces of art in the world, including the Mona Lisa. You're probably familiar with that painting. Leonardo da Vinci painted the Mona Lisa. Now, there's only one Mona Lisa. But if you had a piece of art that was that beautiful, that perfect, some might say, how would you display it? Would you put it in just any old frame? Maybe go get a cheapo frame from the dollar store, or go high class and go buy one at Walmart? Okay. Of course not, right? That would be foolish. If you have a painting that is so rare and so valuable, you would want a frame that is equally beautiful. Right? In fact, the frame says something about the piece of art, doesn't it? A $10 frame from Bed Bath & Beyond is fine for your kid's graduation photo, but it won't do for that priceless piece of art. No offense to your kid and his graduation. Right? And after all, you can always print another copy of the graduation photo, but there's only one Mona Lisa. Right? It's actually an interesting history if you look into it, all of the things that have happened to this painting in the hundreds of years since it was painted, and the number of times that people have tried to destroy it. Really fascinating. I did a little bit of research, not so much about the painting though, but about the frame, Mona Lisa's frame. Did you know the current frame, you can see it pictured here, was built in 1951. It is made from oak that is designed to be especially flexible so it can handle changes in humidity and temperature. The original frame, 1951, had cross braces made from beech wood, but those braces were damaged due to an insect infestation, and so in 1970, the beech was replaced with maple. In 2004, the maple bracing was replaced with sycamore wood, and a metal cross brace was added, and then the entire framed painting was put into a sealed, climate-controlled case that regulates humidity, temperature, and even light exposure. Now, all of that may seem like a lot, but actually, that is all going to be replaced and done away with. Plans are underway currently. They haven't unveiled the winner of the selection of who's going to design this yet. That's going to happen next year, 2026. They're going to reveal who is designing this. But in the coming years, they are going to build an entirely new gallery just to house this iconic painting. So in a way, you could say that by 2031, that's the year that Mona Lisa is going to move into the new gallery. In 2031, Mona Lisa will have a 20,000 square foot picture frame to put her on display. The frame says something about the painting. The value of the painting, the rarity, the beauty, and the uniqueness of the painting. The frame speaks about it. Now, this is a good way to introduce our theme today from the book of Proverbs. We're not talking about art, which is good, because that would pretty much exhaust everything I know about art. But we're talking about the subject of speech and language in the book of Proverbs. Last time, 2 weeks ago, we talked about this. We saw some foundational principles about where our words come from. Where do our words come from? They come from our hearts, according to Proverbs. And what kind of impact those words can have. Now today I want to get into some more specifics, so we're going to be looking at just some specific proverbs that deal with this subject of speech and language. And what does that have to do with Mona Lisa's picture frame? Right? Well, that's what Proverbs 25 and verse 11 is about. And that's where we're going to start this morning. Proverbs 25 and verse 11. So if you're there, look with me at that verse. Here's what it says. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. This proverb is really actually not very difficult to understand, although some of the language of it is a little bit obscure, but really we could think of it this way. Just like the Mona Lisa needs a frame that matches the painting's rarity and beauty, our words need to be framed. They need a frame that is appropriate. Our words, in other words, need to be matched by the right circumstances and the right timing. This is just one of the principles today and that we're going to look at, but some of Proverbs' powerful teaching on speech and communication. If I could put it into one statement, I would say it this way: our words must fit the situation, right? Our words need to fit the situation. That's what it means to frame them properly. All right, the next verse it kind of goes along with this. It teaches a related truth. The next verse in verse 12 says this: like an earring of gold and an ornament of fine gold is a wise rebuker to an obedient ear. Like an earring of gold, he says, is a wise rebuker to an obedient ear. Now, you ever wonder why people wear earrings? I mean, it's a bit strange, I think, to think about putting a hole in your ear and decorating it with a piece of gold. Now, maybe it's not that strange, though, because ears are not exactly something we would call attractive, right? I don't know, maybe. Maybe that's why the first person thought to put a ring in it, right? It's the only way that she could think of to make it not look strange. I don't know. I'm not sure where this came from or what the incentive was. What I do know is here we are 3,000 years later after Solomon wrote this proverb, and people are still punching holes in their ears and sticking gold jewelry into them to improve their appearance. Okay. But what is that compared to? Solomon says it's compared to a wise rebuker and an obedient ear. Right? How are these things alike? Again, there's a kind of fitness, and this is important. There's a kind of fitness between the speaker and the hearer. Just as in verse 11, there's a fitness between the words and their setting. Right? So think of it this way. If you get your daughter's ears pierced when she's young, okay, let's just say she's 5 or 6 or 7 years old, right? And you're going to get your daughter's ears pierced. Do you then go buy her those $5,000 18-karat gold earrings from Tiffany & Company? And I looked them up. That's probably cheaper than they actually are, okay? Most of them were over $6,000, but I just kind of came with the wrong number, right? Are you going to buy her those earrings at 5, 6, 7 years of age? Of course not, right? You want her to learn to appreciate valuable things before you trust her with something like that, right? It's the same thing with wise words of rebuke. And I think that's what Solomon is saying here. Wise words of rebuke. Do you just give them to anybody? Well, some people do. Right? Some people love to give criticism and correction and their opinion to just about everybody. Right? Wise words of rebuke, they're just giving those out for free. Right? But Solomon says, no, wise rebuke, a wise word of correction is actually like a pair of gold earrings that need to be appreciated. They're valuable. You don't just give them to anybody. So you got to think about timing and circumstances. This is what the key is here. The words have to fit the situation. If you're going to offer those wise words of rebuke, you got to think about the timing. You got to think about the circumstances. You got to think about whom you expect to receive it. Will this person receive this as a valuable gift, like a pair of expensive gold earrings? Or will they be likely to lose them because they're careless and it doesn't really mean that much to them? There's a reason that Jesus said something, I think, similar to this. He said, don't toss your pearls before pigs. Right? We understand that, don't we? Pig's not going to appreciate the jewelry. Well, Solomon is maybe not quite as blunt here in the way that he says it. He's offering maybe the other side of the coin, but again, this is a valuable precious thing, wise words of rebuke. So let me ask you, would you like to receive a piece of fine gold jewelry? Would you like to receive that? Well, according to Solomon, that's what correction is from a wise man or woman. So if you won't receive a rebuke, what makes you think you'd be able to appreciate the value and beauty of expensive jewelry? See? There's some important principles that are at play here. This is on the other side of the coin, I would say. You and I need to strive to have an obedient ear, someone that a wise rebuker will recognize and consider worth the time and cost of correcting. Like many Proverbs, this applications here are multifaceted. I think the importance here of the fitness of words, right? Whether it's the person who's offering the rebuke is thinking about who is going to receive them. Is this a good circumstance? Am I sharing a rebuke at a right time? Or whether we're on the other side, do we want to receive it? Are we going to receive this as it really is, as if it was something valuable and precious? Right? Now, we talked before about the connection between a person's heart and his words. Solomon used a spring of water that produces clear, cool water, that illustration. Pure words, we said, flow out of a pure heart. But there's another aspect of this that I want to explore for just a minute. So we'll look at a couple more verses. In fact, we're just continuing on. So verses 11 and 12 talk about the fitness of the situation. All right, but if you look at verse 13 and then verse 14, we have another couple of Proverbs that teach us something about speech. Like the cold of snow in time of harvest, he says in verse 13, is a faithful messenger to those who sent him, for he refreshes the soul of his masters. Whoever falsely boasts of giving is like clouds and wind without rain. Now, there's two messengers here contrasted in these two verses of Proverbs. Right? Two different kinds of messengers. The first messenger here is trustworthy. The second messenger is somebody who boasts about a gift he does not actually possess. And the first messenger is honest, faithful, reliable. The second is self-centered, arrogant, and boastful. And again, he can't actually back up his boasts, the things that he's bragging about. So which kind of man would you rather hire? If you're faced with a choice, do you want to hire the faithful messenger from verse 13? Or do you want to hire the one who makes empty boasts and promises in verse 14? Which man would you hire? Should be obvious. The faithful man, Solomon says, is like snow on a harvest day. I would put this a little bit differently because we don't live in the same culture and time as Solomon. I would say something like this. The faithful man is like driving an air-conditioned combine when you harvest your grain. That's what the snow on the day of harvest is like for them, right? Remember, Solomon didn't have AC, okay? So snow is the best thing he can come up with. But think about that. Can you harvest your grain without AC? Well, yeah, people have been doing that for thousands of years. But it's a whole lot nicer to have a cool cab to sit in, right? Can you drive your car around without AC? Yeah, of course you can. It's a whole lot nicer to have AC. I remember when we lived in New Mexico, our minivan that we had, the AC went out on it. And we were pretty poor. So paying for AC was not super high on the list of things that we wanted to do. But living in the desert Southwest, we realized it wasn't really an option, especially since we had little kids sitting in the back of that minivan and it would get pretty toasty in there. And so we had to put in the money to do that. Okay? And it was expensive, right? Well, last summer my AC on my truck went out, quit working. And I just decided, you know what? It's Wisconsin. It's not the desert, so I can live without AC. So I did. I lived the entire summer, last summer, without AC. This year I decided to fix it. Okay? I mean, you can do it, right? You can do it. You can get by. People got by without it for a long time. But, man, it is really nice having cold blowing AC in the middle of the summertime. It really is. And that's what Solomon is saying here. This is the difference. This is the contrast between the faithful messenger and the unfaithful one, the boastful one, right? It's the difference between having AC or not. It's refreshing. But here's the principle that's in play here, okay? So here's the principle. If I was going to summarize this in principle, I'd put it this way. Words have to be backed up by character, right? The character of the messenger matters. Have you ever had somebody promise something that he couldn't deliver? Because this is what the second messenger is like. Somebody who promises something that he can't deliver. You know, like the hairstylist who told you that she could give you the haircut that's all the rage and you'll look just like a movie star. Right? Or the car salesman who says, oh yeah, we can get you into it at that price. Then he goes and talks to his manager and he finds out, well, that's only for VIPs and the owner's kids. Right? You don't qualify. That's pretty frustrating though when somebody claims to have a gift. They claim that there's something they can do for you and you find out that's just not true. They're raising expectations that they can't meet. Solomon says that is like having clouds and wind, but no rain. Now again, we're not in the middle of a drought right now, so this is not a big concern to us. But if you think about those years when we have drought conditions, you see that, don't you, sometimes? Clouds up, wind, and get clouds, and you're thinking, okay, good, we're going to get some rain, and then it blows on over. And they get rain north of I-94, and Chicago gets rain, and we're sitting here dry as a bone, right? That happens some years, doesn't it? Again, we used to live in the desert Southwest. This was a regular thing. It would happen a lot. So what's the term for that? When it gets cloudy, and it's dark clouds and there's wind blowing and maybe even some lightning and then it blows over and there's no rain. What's the word for that? Disappointment, right? We were hoping for something. The clouds made us think we were going to get something. We looked at it and thought, boy, it looks like we're going to get some rain. But then we're disappointed. Solomon says that's what it's like when you have an unreliable messenger. That's what it's like when you have a messenger who boasts about what he can do, but he doesn't actually follow through. So to go back to the earlier illustration from verse 13, if the faithful messenger is you get in your car on a hot day, you turn it on, you push the button and the AC blows cold air, this guy, this is what happens when you get in there and you hit the button and nothing comes out but more hot air and you stick to your seats. And it doesn't work. Right? The light's on, you push the button, but nothing happens. Right? And again, what's the difference between the two? It really comes down to the character of the messenger. Solomon says the first one's reliable. He's someone who can be trusted to deliver the message. He's going to deliver the message exactly as he received it. He's going to deliver the message to the person that he's sent to take it to. And you know he's going to do that. It's refreshing. I give this guy the message and I can forget about it because I know he's going to take care of it. He's going to do what he's supposed to do. He's going to do what he said. Right? It just works. I turn the car on, I hit the button, cold air blows out. It feels good. It's refreshing. The other guy, I have no idea. He tells me he can do this, but then it doesn't follow through. I end up disappointed. And really, what is the issue with this guy? He's dishonest. Why does he promise something he can't deliver? Why would somebody do that? Isn't he going to be found out? Well, the reality is the reason he does that is he's expecting that by the time it's discovered that he can't produce it, he's already gotten what he wanted and he's on to the next thing. He's not worried about that. He's hoping that by the time you realize what kind of person he is, he's off to bigger and better things. And so it's important for us to understand what Solomon is saying here. What matters isn't just the words that we speak. It's the character with which we speak them. Now, the negative side of this is also illustrated in chapter 26, right? So look there in chapter 26, verse 7. He says this, like the legs of the lame that hang limp is a proverb in the mouth of fools. Verse 8 says, like one who binds a stone in a sling is he who gives honor to a fool. And verse 9, like a thorn that goes into the hand of a drunkard is a proverb in the mouth of fools. I think these three verses really go together. But 7 and 9 deal mostly with speech here, the idea of a proverb in the mouth of a fool. But what is a proverb? A proverb is the epitome of wisdom. So what good does a wise saying do in the mouth of a fool? You see, you got to think about this for a second. Is there a defect in the proverb? Is there some flaw in the wisdom when a fool gets a hold of it? No, nothing wrong with the proverb. Nothing wrong with the wisdom. It's still just as wise, right? But what's the difference? Verse 7 says that the proverb is completely worthless in the mouth of a fool. Because of his character, because he's a fool, when you give him the proverb in his mouth, it's like a lame man. What good does his legs do to him? Nothing. They just dangle there. That's the point. The proverb is completely ineffective in the mouth of a fool because of his character. But verse 9 actually gives us a little bit of a different picture. Verse 9 suggests that it's not just ineffective, it's actually dangerous. Depending on the exact translation and how verse 9 reads, different versions read a little differently. Some of them suggest that this should read a little bit differently, like it would say something like a stick with thorns in the hand of a drunkard. Right? The problem isn't with the proverb. The problem is with the character of the man who is speaking it. So if he's a fool and you give him the wisdom, you give him the proverb and he wields it, what is he going to do with it? Well, it's going to be either worthless or destructive. But it's not going to serve its purpose. It's not going to bring wisdom and build up. It's going to destroy. It's going to be a drunkard wielding a thorny stick. Well, I don't want to be anywhere near that guy. Right? Because who knows what could happen? That's the problem. And that's what he's saying here. The issue is, because of his character, giving him a proverb, again, this is like, given the 15-year-old who's just got her permit, the keys to the Corvette, and saying, hey, have a ball. Not going to happen, by the way. Now, I don't have a Corvette, but even if I did, would never happen, okay? Right, but that's the thing. It's not only is it they're not going to be able to use it effectively, but it's dangerous. That's what Solomon is saying here. Because of the character of the person here. He's a fool. He'll either waste the wisdom or he'll use it in a destructive way. And this, I think, again, ties back into the principle about timing and the fitness of words. Right? The words may be right, but you put that proverb, you put that wisdom, you put those right words in the mouth of a fool, and what do you get? It's either ineffective or it's dangerous. Not because there's something wrong with the words, but because he's going to use it poorly. And again, going back to the first principle, he may just use it in an inappropriate setting. Right? The best determiner of the right use of the words is going to be the character of the man or woman who is using them. And that's an important principle. Words need to be backed up by character. Now, this doesn't mean the words don't matter. All right? Words can be incredibly powerful. And they can accomplish a great deal either for good or for evil. We've already seen that, but we're going to touch back on that again here. So let's first consider how our words can be effective in the right circumstances. Okay, look at chapter 25 and verse 15. By long forbearance, a ruler is persuaded, and a gentle tongue breaks the bone. Right? Another version says it this way: a ruler can be persuaded through patience, and a gentle tongue can break a bone. Now, you look, starting with the last part of that proverb, think about the picture there. A tongue breaking bones. Well, that seems like a little bit of a stretch, right? Tongue's not going to break a bone. So you think of it. But the point of this is that patience and gentleness of speech can often be more powerful than direct forcefulness. Right? And again, in the context of this proverb, think about trying to persuade a king to do something he doesn't want to do. Think about trying to persuade a king to change his mind about something. How are you going to do it? Do you just say, nope, you're wrong. You should listen to me. I know what's best. Is that going to work? Is that very effective? Of course not. But if you keep your head, if you speak gently, if you speak with persistence, you will have a much better chance of success. That's what Solomon is saying. Something that you could not get done any other way could be accomplished through words alone. Right? You're not going to be able to overrule him. You don't have the authority. You're not going to be able to do it through direct confrontation. But with your words, Solomon says, you may be able to persuade him if you approach it properly. Again, words used in the right circumstances, in the right way, can be very effective. Look at chapter 27, because here we see a couple more examples of this kind of principle being played out. The right words being used in the right circumstances. Chapter 27, verse 2. He says this, let another man praise you and not your own mouth, a stranger and not your own lips. Right? This is an example, I would say, of words being used in the right circumstances. Does anybody like a braggart? Does anybody like someone who is always talking about himself and what he has accomplished and what he can do? Anybody enjoy being around a person like that? I don't think so. Not really. I mean, you might find some people who will fawn over someone like that. I imagine this is what like a celebrity entourage might, be about. Just people that just want to hang on, and so they'll pretend to love being around somebody who's totally obsessed with himself and loves to talk about himself all the time. But I think, generally speaking, normal people anyways, are not impressed by someone's self-promotion. I mean, even if the things that person says are true, right? Even if they really are that good, it's just nobody wants to be around the person that's just constantly bragging about themselves. And so what Solomon says here is true praise comes from others. In fact, Solomon says true praise comes from strangers. Interesting. He says, let another man praise you, a stranger, not your own lips. A stranger, someone who is, I think the idea here is this is somebody who has no reason to flatter you. This is not somebody who has anything to gain, right? This is somebody who's not connected to you necessarily. They're not going to gain anything by telling you how great you are, by flattering you. They're a stranger. They're somebody who's outside of your circle. And therefore, when they praise you, when they speak of your abilities and your strengths and your accomplishments, those words are much more likely to be accurate. And of course, then again, what he's saying, you're not bragging and boasting of yourself. Someone else is building you up. Right? This is the right way that praise should be done, okay? It's not self-praise, but praise from others who don't stand to benefit from praising you. Probably would all benefit from thinking about that, understanding that, appreciating that principle a little bit. Help us to rightly evaluate when someone does praise us. Are they praising us because there's a benefit for them, or are they praising us because they genuinely have no skin in the game and they just recognize something that's praiseworthy? But let's look at a couple more verses here. Another example from chapter 27, verse 5 and 6. He says this in verse 5, open rebuke is better than love carefully concealed. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but the kisses of an enemy are deceitful. Open rebuke is better than love carefully concealed. It's an interesting kind of dynamic here. Years ago, my wife and I used to watch the TV show Deal or No Deal sometimes. Now, if you haven't seen the show, the premise of it is pretty simple. There are 26 briefcases. Each briefcase has a random number inside, I think ranging from like $50 up to $1 million. At the beginning of the game, the contestant chooses one briefcase, hoping that he, out of those 26, just has happened to pick the one that has $1 million in it. Right? That's what his hope is. Then, as the game goes on, one by one, the other cases are opened. Each case, when it's open, reveals a certain amount of money designated inside. And when that case is opened, that means the contestant didn't win that money. Right? Every case that's opened is money that's lost now. It can't be won. Right? So, as a result, the relative value of the first case, the one that he picked, is going to go up or down based on what is revealed. Right? Because you're going to look at, well, how many of these monetary values are left, right? And then if there's more of the big numbers left and fewer briefcases, that means there's a better chance that the big money's in his briefcase, right? He's got that $1 million or some very large amount. Now, at strategic points during the game, what happens is there's a banker who works for the show, and they offer to buy the contestant's briefcase for a certain amount of money, and offer this money to the contestant. And the contestant can take the money and sell the briefcase for that amount of money, not knowing what's inside it, or they can keep playing, again, in the hope that they have the really big money in their briefcase that they're going to win. Now, the reason the show was entertaining and it created a bit of drama is it was this interplay between the amount of money being offered and the amount of money that we hoped would be won. But the reality is there was this back and forth between what you knew. You could see some of the briefcases being opened up. You could see those amounts. You didn't know how much was in the contestant's briefcase. You knew how much was being offered. You didn't know how much was in the briefcase. If they offered $500,000 and you open that briefcase up, it might only contain $50,000. Boy, that's a big win. Then again, if they offered $200,000 and you accept that, you open this up, it might have $1 million in it. And you missed out. And so the result was, because you had this back and forth between what you could see, what was obvious and open, and what you couldn't see, it created this suspense. And that's kind of what verse 5 reminds me of a little bit. This idea of something that's open and something that's concealed. Which one is better? An open word of rebuke or secret love? Now, again, we have to think about this based on what we know of the book of Proverbs already. Proverbs teaches us over and over again that rebuke is actually a good thing. As hard as that is to accept, as hard as it is for us to hear someone with a word of rebuke, for someone to look at you in the face and say, I think you are wrong. That's hard to accept. But Proverbs tells us that is actually good. Remember, we saw this. It's a wise rebuker to an obedient ear is an earring of gold. It's valuable. Right? And the book of Proverbs says anyone who refuses to hear rebuke is a fool and is headed for disaster. And so if you won't listen when someone says, hey, I think you are wrong, then Proverbs says you're headed for disaster. So we have to evaluate this using that, keeping that in mind. How should we think about an open rebuke? On the other hand, we all want to be loved, right? We all want to be approved of. We all want others to say how great they think we are. We want to be loved and accepted, right? That's a natural thing. But here's the question. What good does love do if it is concealed? On some level, we can even ask the question, is concealed love really love at all? If it's not expressed, if it's not demonstrated in some way. See, If a person loves us but they're afraid to tell us, or they won't tell us, that seems almost like not really loving at all. That's almost like a self kind of love. They're afraid to tell us the way things really are. That's not loving. They won't give us the open rebuke that we need to hear because of some sort of twisted sense of love that refuses to reveal itself. How do we evaluate then? Open rebuke or secret love? Which one of these is better? Well, Solomon makes it very clear. Open rebuke is better. We need to learn to appreciate the value of real friendship. Appreciate the value of open rebuke, and according to verse 6, of wounds even. You see, our enemy would destroy us by only ever saying nice things about us, never telling us when there's a problem, never actually warning us when we have gone wrong. Out of some sort of love? Not really. Verse 6 tells us that the kisses of the enemy are deceitful. Right? We need to watch out for someone who only kisses you and never confronts you when you're wrong. Because it's not love. Not really. Solomon says open rebuke is better. Here. So we need to consider the fact that words are very powerful tools and can be used for great good if they are put in the right circumstances. Used the right way. Open rebuke. Praise coming from others. These are good things, but it's important in the right circumstances, in the right way. Now, rebuke just for rebuke's sake isn't loving either, though. Right? So again, there are sometimes that someone might say, well, I'm just being honest, right? I just got to be honest. And there's that kind of let it all hang out attitude that some people have. That's not at all what Proverbs is advocating for. Okay? But we need to understand the value of words used effectively, used in right circumstances. But on the other hand, we also have to look at the warnings here in Proverbs about the danger of destructive speech. So let's look at Proverbs 25 and verse 18 first. Proverbs 25 and verse 18. A man who bears false witness against his neighbor is like a club, a sword, and a sharp arrow. A man who bears false witness against his neighbor, like a club, a sword, and a sharp arrow. Then just turn over to chapter 26 and verses 18 and 19. Again, something very similar. Like a madman who throws firebrands, arrows, and death is the man who deceives his neighbor, and says, I was only joking. The principle here, words can be devastating when used for evil. Words can be devastating when used for evil. Now, have you ever wielded a club, a sword, or a sharp arrow? I haven't had a lot of experience with clubs or swords, but I do enjoy bow hunting in the fall. One of the things that surprised me when I first started bow hunting, because I just didn't have any experience with it, and started shooting broadheads, is just how far they will go through whatever you shoot them at. Part of the problem is, you watch TV and movies, and you see people shoot arrows, and the arrow goes in a couple of inches and it stops in people. But that's not very realistic. I've learned from experience. With only one exception that I can think of in the last 6 years of bow hunting, every arrow that I've shot into a deer has passed entirely through the deer. The expression like a warm knife through butter comes to mind. It's how those arrows fly and how sharp they are and how much damage they do. They cut all the way through. Right? And I have actually seen through hunting the damage done by both arrows and bullets, and I have to say honestly, I think the sharp arrows are worse. I don't have any intention anytime soon of being shot with either one, but like I said, having seen what the arrows do, that would be worse, I think. Pretty bad. Solomon brings this up here. Why? Because he tells us that that's how damaging our words can be. He says false witness is like taking a club, a sword, or a sharp arrow to your neighbor. I mean, again, how many of us would do that? Would ever think of doing that? Would think about attacking our neighbor with a weapon intending to kill him? And yet Solomon says, if you bear false witness, if you lie, you're effectively doing that. That's how serious it is. To slander someone is an act of utter hatred. Solomon compares it to a kind of murder. Now, I think on one level, when he says bearing this idea of bearing false witness here, probably in Solomon's mind in the context here, probably has to do with a legal setting, right? Being in court and bearing witness against your neighbor, but doing so falsely. The word we would use for this is perjury, right? But the idea is a false accusation. And what are you intending to do? Well, you're intending to get him in trouble by making an accusation against him of something he didn't do. And it's a very, very serious thing. Frankly, we've seen this happen in our society. I can think of a few prominent examples in the last 10 or 15 years. I remember one specific example, and I don't want to get into all the details of it, but I remember a specific example out of Duke University a number of years ago. A number of young men were accused of assaulting a woman at a party. And their lives were completely and totally ruined, only to find out a few years later that this woman lied and made the entire thing up. What do we do in that kind of situation? What Solomon is saying here is that kind of false accusation is essentially the same as taking a club, a sword, or an arrow and trying to kill them. If we were just as a society, we would deal with those kind of false accusations as if they were intended for that purpose. We would deal with them as if they were intended for murder, because that's what Solomon says they are. We have an expression today, we use the expression character assassination, because that's what this is. Trying to destroy someone by means of slander, of false accusation. And Solomon says this is akin to murder. That's how serious this is. You and I need to see it that way. What about playing a trick on your neighbor? That's what chapter 26, verse 18 and 19 is about, right? It's just a joke, he says. I'm just having a little fun. Solomon says deceiving your neighbor and then playing it off as a joke is essentially the same as throwing flaming darts or deadly arrows. So how funny is it when someone carelessly sets his neighbor's house on fire? Just a joke. What's a big deal, right? Or somebody ignites a wildfire and it destroys an entire community. We've seen this happen, haven't we? I was just playing around. What's the big deal? No, Solomon says this is serious. Solomon says if you can't get out of, well, I fired a flaming arrow at my neighbor's house and burned it down. If the excuse, I was just messing around, doesn't get you out of that, well, it shouldn't get you out of deception, lies, falsehoods either. Right? Again, this is so important. When we play fast and loose with the truth and then pass it off as a joke, I think the truth is we cannot afford to pretend that our words are harmless. Whether we're talking about husbands and wives and how we speak to each other, parents and children, church members, co-workers, neighbors, or on the internet, anywhere. If we lie, if we deceive, if we use false charges and accusations, Solomon says this is as serious as if we were arsonists, attempted murderers. Our words are powerful and potent and can be incredibly devastating if we use them for evil. Now, as I said before, there's so much more that could be said. But as we close, I want us just to take to heart James's warning about words. We touched on this last time as well, but it's so important to repeat this because James, I think the book of James has often been called the Proverbs of the New Testament for good reason, because James, so much of what James says ties back into the book of Proverbs. In James chapter 3 and verse 2, he begins to talk about the tongue, and he says, we all stumble in many ways. If anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is mature, able also to control the whole body. He goes on later to say, though the tongue is a small part of the body, it boasts great things. Consider how a small fire sets ablaze a large forest. Remember what Solomon just said. The man who deceives his neighbor and then says, I was just joking, is actually shooting flaming arrows. James says that little tongue can fan a huge flame. James goes on to say, no one can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil, full of deadly poison. With the tongue we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse people who are made in God's likeness. Blessing and cursing come from the same mouth. My brothers and sisters, these things should not be this way. Now Solomon says in Proverbs 1:5, a wise man will hear and increase learning, and a man of understanding will attain to wise counsel. So the question is very simple today. Will you listen to the wisdom of Proverbs? Recognize the power of your words to do good or evil. Will you accept correction, instruction, rebuke? Will you confess your sin and seek God's grace in forgiving your sin and in reining in your tongue? Maybe your inability to control your speech is making you realize that you don't even have a real relationship with God. It's interesting that when Paul wants to prove in Romans 3 that every single person who has ever lived anywhere on the face of the globe is guilty before God, he says, there is none righteous, no, not one. And then he goes on to list the unrighteousness. And what Paul focuses on is their words. He says there's poison in their tongue. That's the one thing that Paul points to when he says the world, every single person is guilty. The one thing he points to is the tongue. James is saying the same thing. None of us is innocent. So maybe you realize because of your speech, because of your inability to control your tongue, what that means is you don't know God. And then if that's the case, the awareness of your sin ought to humble you. It ought to cause you to turn to the Lord and ask Him today to forgive you, to receive you as His child. Don't harden your heart and turn away. If you are a Christian, you know how difficult it is. You know how often you fail. What do? Do we turn away? Do we say, well, that's just who I am. I've always been that way. I can't change. My mom was that way. My dad was that way. Grandpa was that way. I come by it honestly. It's who I am. Or do we submit to the Lord and to the wisdom of His Word regarding our speech? Let's pray. Father, we thank You for